I'm not saying that everyone should be a CEO or president because not everyone wants to, not everyone has the skills to do it, but there's a broader form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And what I found is that when people talk about leadership, and more importantly, when they teach leadership, particularly to young people, that type of leadership is ignored. And the only type that is sort of broadcast or taught to people are the ones associated with titles and power and influence. And so for me, the type of leadership that's always been taught, I'm not saying it's not leadership. I'm saying it's a subsection of a broader concept, and we're not teaching the broader concept.
Have you ever heard of an idea called everyday leadership? If you have, the chances are it's because you've seen the YouTube video, the TED Talk by Drew Dudley. He talks all about the idea of everyday leadership, and the idea behind it is that leadership can and should be about those small daily impacts that each of us can have, even if we don't hold the job or title of leader. Every week, I ask a guest at the end of each episode to name me one of their leadership heroes. Well, one of mine is Drew Dudley, specifically because of this TED Talk. And so it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to have him on the show today. Tell you a bit more about him. Since that TED Talk, the Everyday Leadership, also known as the Lollipop Moment, which he did back in 2010. Since then, he's become an internationally acclaimed leadership speaker. He is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author and, of course, created Everyday Leadership. Today, as well as being a speaker and being on the road for much of his year, he's also the founder and chief catalyst of the Day One Leadership Company. So I really can't put into words how excited I am to have him on the show today. I'm not going to beat about the bush anymore. We're going to dive straight in, get Drew on the show, and have what I'm sure is going to be an amazing conversation.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
So I'm joined today by Mr. Drew Dudley. It is great to have you on the show. I must say I'm a long-time fan, having seen your very first TED Talk back when I was doing my master's some years ago. It's lovely to have you. Welcome to Leading with Integrity.
I'm thrilled to be here, David. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show, as I say. And I'm going to hand the reins over to you for a little bit, really, to introduce yourself to listeners, for any of them who may not know who you are, a bit about your background, what you get up to today, what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, I'm a author and a speaker for the most part now. I was formerly an educator at the University of Toronto in Canada and ran their leadership development program for about a decade and built that. There wasn't one when I got there, so it was an amazing experience getting to figure out what it was that we wanted to instill when it came to leadership in young people, what kind of perspectives, what kind of empowerment we could provide. Prior to that, I found myself in that role because I was running Canada's biggest national student charity in support of Cystic Fibrosis Canada. And that got me into the concept of training, into the concept of speaking and running interactive sessions that were designed to accomplish specific things. What I didn't realize is that ultimately, what I was doing was teaching leadership. All the individual skills that we use to create these campaigns to raise money were ultimately leadership skills, but I never thought of them that way. And then the dean at the University of Toronto saw one of these presentations I was giving, came to me and said, "We're looking for an educator to build our program that focuses less on theory, on titles, on how to get people jobs, and more on how to create people or help create people who are great at jobs." So we're not trying to help people get great jobs. We're trying to produce people who are great at their job and have great lives while they do it. I did that for about a decade. And then my students, without my knowledge, because I refused to do it myself, nominated me to do that TED event you referenced. I fought really hard against doing it, then finally kind of overcame that fear, that trepidation that I'm going to look like an idiot, and did this talk. And if you watch it, it's 6.5 minutes of terror. I do an 8-minute talk in 6 minutes. I'm speaking so quickly. And I walked off the stage and there was someone standing there saying, do you want to do this for a living? We think that companies should hear this message. I said, sure, figuring a couple times a year, I'll get to go out and speak to somebody. And it turned into about 110 times a year. And I'm on the road about 250 times a year sharing ideas from this process that we developed at the University of Toronto with a group of senior students. I call it operationalizing leadership values. We can get into it later if you want, but ultimately it's a personal accountability tool that we kind of stumble onto by accident by continually messing up at the university, which is how most sort of discoveries happen. Things that work that you didn't expect to work very rarely happen when someone says, Eureka. Usually what leads to a new discovery is someone going, well, that's weird. And so we ended up creating this process that I've been teaching now for about 15 years. I wrote a book that went on to become a bestseller, which still blows my mind, that talks about the experience of building the program and the process. And what gets me out of bed in the morning is getting to share it and still sort of dealing with this concept that people like you reach out and say, I've been a fan, or I saw your talk and it impacted me this way, or I read your book and it changed this in my life. It is still surreal to me that things that I've created have changed people's trajectory. And that to me is incredibly humbling, a little bit hard to believe, but something that is unbelievably gratifying. So that's where I stand right now. I'm here for a day at my home studio in Toronto, and then I'm back on the road for 11 days, which is kind of how life works for me. It's a lot of hotel rooms, windowless hotel ballrooms, and then back to an airport.
Well, I mean, the main thing is you enjoy it though, right?
90% of the time it's amazing. And there are times when you're stuck in an airport in, South Dakota, with snow falling around and you're not sure you're ever going to see civilization again. That happens every now and then. But often what I'll do is there'll be these little things in the world, whether it's a show that I watch or a book that I read or an interview that I see from someone, that reminds me how extraordinarily lucky I am. That I got to stand on the Great Wall of China, and that I've gotten to be in Dubai and Africa and South America and the Caribbean. And every now and then I am reminded how few people get to do that and how unbelievably lucky I am to not only travel to those places, but to have a purpose to do it.
Yeah, indeed. And if it makes you feel better as far as the 6 minutes of terror goes, I don't think it really comes through that you're scared out of your mind.
I'm glad. I think I just come off as energetic.
Yeah, well, I mean, they do say that how nerves can be perceived quite a lot. So, yeah, I mean, I have to say it was when I first saw that talk, it was at a particularly difficult point in my own career. I was struggling with leadership generally as a concept and also with the leader I was working with. And it completely changed my perspective about what leadership could be as opposed to how people actually saw it traditionally, let's say. And it is such an important message. Leadership can be for everyone. It doesn't have to be a job title or a paycheck, although sometimes it's nice to have those as well.
Without a doubt. I think a big part of my work is this idea that I'm not saying that everyone should be a CEO or president, because not everyone wants to, not everyone has the skills to do it, but there's a broader form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And what I found is that when people talk about leadership, and more importantly, when they teach leadership, particularly to young people, that type of leadership is ignored. And the only type that is sort of broadcast or taught to people are the ones associated with titles and power and influence. And so for me, the type of leadership that's always been taught, I'm not saying it's not leadership. I'm saying it's a subsection of a broader concept, and we're not teaching the broader concept.
I agree with that, definitely. Well, I'm not going to disagree with you, obviously.
I'll go ahead if you like. There's all kinds of things. I learn the most when people are like, here's the hole in your argument. What really is an eye-opener is when you realize that is 100% a massive hole in my argument. And let's go figure out why it's there, and if there's a fill for it, or whether I've got to start changing the way I look at things. I love that.
Well, maybe later. Not yet. Yeah. I haven't reached the point yet.
I'll try to say something ridiculous. There'll be one thing I say that's ridiculous, and we'll see if you catch it.
Oh, no. Now I feel like I'm being tested. Yeah. So tell us more about the book then. It's called This Is Day One, I believe. The TED Talk sparked it, obviously. And I think the talk itself has had, what is it, over 5 million views now on YouTube? Many of those were probably me, I have to admit.
Yeah, I haven't actually checked, because to see the number of views, you also have to see the comments.
Right.
And one thing that I have certainly learned, and my friends told me this before the TED Talk was posted, do not read the comments. It's the same thing with the book. And because, let's say, I think the reviews have been overwhelmingly positive, but what I'll do is I'll click on the 1 star and just read how I'm terrible. The book is called This Is Day One. Honestly, the book was written because when you're a speaker, you have about an hour on stage, and you start speaking about the ideas that you have. And then in the process of traveling around, articulating your current ideas, you start to talk to amazing people and you learn more. You get more stories, but you only have an hour still. So you start to move things that matter to you out of your presentation so that you can talk about new concepts. But what eventually happens is I get 1 hour to speak and I've got 12 hours of things I want to talk about. That's when the book is born, because this is the opportunity to take all the time that you need to explain the whole concept. And I had about 12 years of ideas that had made their way through my presentations, and I wanted to share with people, put into one place, and then we can sort of move on to the next set of things we want to talk about. And so the book, This Is Day One, was born out of a combination of personal experiences, the process we were building at the university, and a bunch of life experiences that I had with amazing guides and people who really helped lead me. The idea of This Is Day One is the idea that on the first day of any massive initiative, whether it's a voyage to better physical health, whether it's a job, whether it's relationships, whether it's your mental health, on the first day of anything really difficult, there is a much stronger commitment, humility, and forgiveness for messing up. And if we can reinforce the idea that we approach every big project in our lives as if it's the first day of that project, what we will do is we will keep that commitment, that humility, and that forgiveness. And I'm not saying that you restart every day. I'm saying you recommit every day. And what you're capable of on the 1000th first day is always more than the first day. But what looking at day one does is it makes sure that you stay committed to the non-negotiable daily behaviors. And that came not only from leadership theory, but my own personal experience with alcohol and going through the process of recovery and being taught that if you don't want to have a drink for the rest of your life, you have to choose not to have a drink today. And then you have to treat every day of the rest of your life as if it's your first day of recovery. Because what you can do then is say, doesn't matter if I had a drink yesterday, doesn't matter, I can have a drink tomorrow. I'm just going to choose not to have one today. And then you repeat that. And what we've done is I've taken that. I say we because my students played such a huge role in putting this together, but my name gets to go on the book. And the idea is that we can do the same with leadership. If not having a drink is the non-negotiable behavior that is part of recovery, then making sure you actively create moments that live your core values is the non-negotiable behavior for leadership. And how do we identify what those core behaviors are? How do we identify the values that drive those behaviors? And how do we stay committed to them? And the book walks through the process of how it was all created, and then identifies 6 core values for the new generation, the new millennium, however you want to put it: impact, growth, courage, empowerment, class, and self-respect. And it talks about a process that's rooted in behavioral psychology that makes it more likely you can live those values. Now, those are only my example values. I help people figure out their own, but the book also dives into each one of those values and provides some strategies for how to better live impact, for how to better embody courage, for how to take care of yourself better through self-respect. So the book is sort of the compilation of 15 years of process and stories. And the idea that it's a practical guide is why it was so important to me to be in the title. Is I wanted people to realize it wasn't just theory. It wasn't just saying, let's think about things differently. It was teaching how to do things differently.
Yeah, that last point in particular, I think, there's so much in the field of leadership theory, isn't there? I mean, I jokingly say there's as many leadership theories as there are theorists. And I do think that's important, though, that having that practical, what can actually make a difference today or tomorrow or next week or whenever, it does matter, because it helps people to actually pick that up and make it real, make it work for them. Whereas, a theory with a long academic name, most people aren't going to read it, let alone apply it.
It's even like you're leading with integrity, right?
Yeah.
People, when I ask them, what are your core values? Like, what's the values that really drive you? Because it's one of the first steps in the process. Integrity is by far the most commonly quoted value. It's always one of the top 3 for people. And I think though it's interesting though, is I always ask people to define the values that they say are core. So let's say if you're listening and integrity is core to you, if you're listening to this podcast, it probably is. But I always ask my students, imagine someone comes up to you and says, English isn't my first language. The word integrity doesn't translate directly into my language. Could you explain what it means in the simplest terms possible and start your answer with a commitment to? So integrity is a commitment to what? And respect is a commitment to what? And accountability is a commitment to what? We use all these terms that are just ubiquitous out there, and very rarely can we actually articulate what they mean. And I've got a semi unpopular view, and I'm always open to having it changed, that integrity isn't actually a value. It isn't. Integrity is the byproduct of living your values. So integrity isn't a value in and of itself. Integrity emerges or is a result of identifying your real values and living them every day. So integrity is bigger than a value. It is sort of the thing that great values generate. Not only great values, but defining them and living them. That's the big key. So it's why when you reached out, I was so excited to come and be a part of this, because that word integrity is one that is used so often, not only within the leadership theorist world, but when I talk to people as they try to understand their role in leadership, integrity. But the actual foundational actions that lead to integrity, no one's thought about. And if we can give people a way of doing that, I think that's great.
It's a great way of looking at it. I think too often it's something that's more of an aspiration than it is of a value. But I think you're right. It's integrity is living your values, isn't it? And I mean, I hear, as you can imagine, lots of different definitions of what it really means. I think one that always sticks in my memory is it's doing the right thing even when no one's looking. I like that. It's probably not quite right, but I like it. It's easy to remember and it's quite meaningful.
Doing the right thing when no one but you is looking.
Well, yeah.
Because someone's always looking, right? And you're there. And that's why I think integrity is it's so hard to live, but it's so gratifying if you can find a way to at least do your best with it. Because there's that period between when you close your eyes at night and you fall asleep. And it's such a scary time because all you think about is all the things you haven't done, all the ways you haven't lived up, whether it's doing tasks, but often being who you want to be. That time between closing your eyes and falling asleep is terrifying. And I think it's why so many of us fall asleep with our screens on, because then we don't have to go through that period. We pass out instead of falling asleep, because the time before falling asleep can be really, really tough on you. And if you can identify things you did every day that are true to the values you care about, at least you have that at night. At least you have this opportunity to argue against that voice in your brain that says you are not a good person. And the problem is, I don't think we give ourselves enough evidence that we can actually enter into the courtroom that night, because it seems like your brain has a lawyer working for it who every night makes an argument that you suck. And I think it's worth entering into evidence, something that counteracts that, because I think we're really tough on ourselves. And if we can give people a way of feeling like they actually did something, even if 90% of what they're thinking is negative, let's give ourselves that 10% to say, yeah, but in this moment, I was someone of courage. In this moment, I was someone of impact. That is just that little evidence that you need to maybe quiet that other voice just a little bit.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's, that phrase, how do you sleep at night? That's a phrase for a reason, isn't it? And it's used in the way it's used for that reason as well. I think most people, we do err on the side of like bashing ourselves and, why did you do that? And overanalyzing what you said to that person that time. And yeah, and it can make it tough to sleep at night. And you're probably right. That's why we all resort to the screen, because you can you numb the brain then, don't you, almost? And it's just an easy way to switch off. Yeah, I've spoken to a few people about the longer term health impacts of that, and there's even studies now, I think, about even like the color of light that comes out of the screen and how that's harmful. I mean, that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, you got to buy special glasses to get rid of blue light.
Yeah, trying to think about that too much.
Yeah, me too.
The damage is done for me, probably. Yeah. Thing you've hit as well on earlier on, another thing that I really love about leadership, which is it's almost universally applicable. And I mean that in the sense of the lessons of leadership can be applied to life generally, but also vice versa, as with your example, with the struggle with alcohol. And then also going the other direction, you're like, don't read the comments section. That's not just good advice for leadership videos on YouTube. That's just good advice for life, isn't it?
I don't think people are honest in the comments, because I think knowing that you can say whatever you want with no consequences changes who you are. And I think that comments are always harsher in some ways than the people actually think, because it's almost cathartic to say nasty things. And so I think sometimes people go further. And so when I take a look at a negative comment, I try to take off 33% for what the person actually thinks and realize that probably in order for them to make that comment, something else in their life happened that put them in a mindset that said, I want to cause pain to someone else, because I think only hurt people hurt others, and almost all pain that to which we are subjected is passed on. And so when someone hurts us, it's usually not about us. It's about pain that's been given to them, and they need to get rid of it somewhere. And I think when we can try to think of it that way, it's still really hurtful and annoying, but there's also an empathy that comes from recognizing that the pain that that person just gave you was given to them. And we all have a certain threshold for pain. And once we're given more than we can handle, we got to go somewhere with it. And I think right now the internet gives a lot of people that outlet. And so for me, things that are said about me, my talks, even people I care about, to me, it's someone letting loose for pain that someone else gave them. And that doesn't make it any worse when someone says, I don't even want to pull some of the stuff that I've read, but that to me is an indication that someone's hurt them. And if you look at it that way, there's an empathy that comes that you can mix with your annoyance, and maybe it pulls back a little bit.
I think that's a very forward-looking way of looking at it.
It's how I keep from crying, man, to be completely honest with you.
No,
you have to find some way of explaining why people are this mean.
Yeah, fair enough. I think you're right about hiding behind the keyboard, though. I think that's a problem almost from the beginnings of the internet. That was a problem, wasn't it? And I think social media has just made it worse and worse. Well, at least with social media, in some of them anyway, there is an actual identity attached to it, so it's harder to be anonymous.
I think the problem is everybody adapts to the culture of wherever they are. That's the nature of culture. And the online culture says go as hard as you can. The online culture currently says that you can be nastier than you would in person. And once that is culturally acceptable, you don't fit in if you don't do it. And so not fitting into a culture is extremely difficult. It's very hard on you. And so I think that that's part of it as well, is that social media allows you to feel a little bit freer. And freedom is something that in a world where you might be struggling with your finances, you might be struggling with your relationship, the world is really tough. I think that to have a place where you feel some degree of freedom is something that I think some people find very cathartic. And unfortunately, it manifests in a nasty way. But I think if we try to look at what are the real life realities of most people on the internet, most people are struggling right now. We're coming out of a pandemic. We are dealing with an economy that's still recovering. We're dealing with an incredibly divisive political environment in one of the most powerful, important countries in the world. And I think that I can understand why people are looking for a place to let loose. And that perspective, I think a lot pushes what I think is a really important leadership skill for the 21st century, which is empathy. And the more I work on my empathy, the less I find myself frustrated. Although I still find myself hurt, but I find myself less likely to lash back out. And I think that to me is a leadership skill that I'm trying very hard to do is, instead of becoming a pass-through for pain and frustration, I'm trying to become a sponge. And then the challenge is, how do you stay healthy while trying to be a sponge for frustration and pain elsewhere? That's why I try to work on what I call the leadership test, this daily accountability tool we developed, because it actually allows me an outlet to deal with this extra pain and frustration that I'm trying to take on so I don't pass it along.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a lot to take on your shoulders, isn't it?
I don't take it on my shoulders. I try to immediately find a way to get it off.
Well,
because to take it on your shoulders without some sort of plan to move it off, you are really asking for it. Yeah. And look, I fail all the time. I was mean 2 days ago, and as soon as I walked out, I was like, why did you do that? Because it wasn't about that person at all. It was that other thing that you're dealing with at work. But if you can become more aware of that, you can control it a little better.
Yeah, because it's so easily done, isn't it? The off-the-cuff remark. I mean, the cliche one is the server or whoever in the restaurant, the hospitality industry. They always seem to get the brunt of this sort of thing, don't they? Empathy, I agree with you as well on that. I mean, we hear it's another one of these phrases, isn't it, where it's repeated so many times it starts to lose its meaning. But emotional intelligence is the big one, isn't it? After IQ, then it became EQ. There is an aspect of that which is really what you're talking about in a lot of ways, that is so often overlooked by people who are aspiring to this empathy, which is also managing your own emotions as well as understanding those of others. And I think that is something else that leaders really need to be working on for the future.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, especially with, generational differences within how people react to work, how they react to feedback, how they seek freedom in their job, even if they're not the person in charge. One of the things that we try to do with this process is remind people that there are things in their lives over which they have control, and that is their individual behavior. But I think that any leader now who is trying to lead a group of people has to recognize that how they feel is a huge motivator in how they work. And that has always been the case. But I think more so now than ever before, emotional intelligence and the ability to think to yourself, I think empathy is a commitment to being able to recognize the emotional impact someone else is feeling. To seek to understand the emotional impact that someone is feeling, and to not just ask, will this decision be effective, but to ask, how will this decision impact people? Because while the decision A may be effective, if it causes pain to people, then the next time you have to make a decision, it's going to be less effective. And so it's really a constant balancing act between figuring out, okay, this would be the best way to do it, but this is going to leave a lot of destruction in its wake. So is it the best way to do it if we're making decisions over a block of time, as opposed to in this particular moment? How does that impact the people who work for me? How does that impact the people I work with in terms of their emotional health? That I don't think was paid attention to before. And there's still lots of companies where nothing else above profit will ever be the deciding factor. And that's a tough one, but it's the nature of the world. The key is, if you can't handle that well, because some people can, some people are really great and they thrive in that environment and they're very emotionally tough and they recognize that there's nothing wrong with making a decision that might ruffle some feathers. I, on the other hand, if I think a decision is going to ruffle one person's feathers, really sort of dwell on it. And I think somewhere in the middle is the way to go, to be aware of the impact, acknowledge the impact that it might have on people, and explain why it might be necessary. When people can see that you have at least given some thought to how this will impact them, and you're willing to listen to their feedback on how to make that impact more manageable, I think people will deal with tough emotions if you show that you thought about it, that you did not make that decision lightly, and that you recognize and are there to support the emotional fallout that comes from your decisions, I think is crucial.
Yeah, it makes me think of I don't know if it's age old, but certainly the whole, the shareholder comes first. That's why the business is here. It's for profit. It's to give money back to the shareholders. That's our only purpose. And I think, to a certain point, I can see the logic, ultimately it's the shareholders who own the business. They've paid for it. It's what it's there to do. But at the same time, if you're not looking after the people who are turning the handle or making the widgets or delivering the service, it's not going to happen anyway. So
yeah. Isn't it weird that for most companies, the people who most directly interact with the world, with the clients, with the customers, and therefore have the biggest impact on the perception of an organization are the ones that are paid the least in the organization. So in many ways, forget all the marketing, forget all those departments. The people who form people's feeling about an organization are the ones who are on the front line, and they're paid the least. And if we can't pay people more for the front lines, what we need to do is provide something that benefits individuals for the work that they are doing. And if you can't pay people more, and some businesses can't, some people would rather put it towards the shareholders, but that's a whole other conversation. But there needs to be some way to let these individuals know how much they matter and how much their interactions matter. Because if you don't allow individuals to realize how much their behaviors impact other people, not for the benefit of the organization, but just how they send people out into the world every day, I think when we can let people know that they are much more empowered than they've traditionally been led to believe, I think that we can see real shifts in organizations. Because I just boggles my mind how the biggest unit of people who interact with the greater world and therefore create the impressions of a business, they're paid the least and they're respected the least. If we can increase the respect for the both from the organization and from the individuals themselves, I think that it's a more rewarding workplace. I wish we could pay people more, but if you can't, at the very least, make sure you pay them in as much respect as possible and empowerment as possible. And I think that's really crucial.
Yeah, it's funny when you think about it, isn't it? And then maybe it's the project manager in me, but to me, I look at that and think that is a huge risk that the business is taking by not doing that. And you can say, well, it's because of the shareholders and we've got to think about them first. Or you can say, I don't really care. Doesn't bother me. They're just there to do a job, whatever. But it is a risk. Like you're opening up your business to a huge potential reputational risk, actual damage if they all just get fed up one day and down tools and walk away. Your business could collapse if you don't look after those people. So the cost of doing something, and it may, as you say, it may need to be in terms of respect or empowerment or the less tangible things if you can't afford it as a business to do it with pay. I agree as well. It should be ideally both. But why would you not do that? That's the bit I never quite get about companies that do it the other way.
Well, I think I've started to look at it like this. Take a step back. If you're a boss, take a step back and look at your organization and ask yourself honestly, do we treat people like batteries, or do we treat them as tools is the wrong word. Do we treat them as opportunities to generate power for the organization? And what I mean by that is that both batteries and a plug generate power. One of them is limited, one of them is unlimited. So you can either see your organization as something battery powered and the individuals that are part of it are the batteries and you use them until they're empty and then they move on. Or do you try to create an organization that's more like a power bar, where you have helped organize and create something that has the opportunity to power other people? So your employees aren't what power the company, its structures, its values, and the rewards that come from working for it, financial and otherwise, are something that good people can plug into. Because if you can build an organization that allows good people to plug in and get energized, that one is unlimited power. And people are not going to unplug themselves from something that makes them feel powerful. But it also is, I think, a more humane, oh God, that's a weird word, but a more respectful way of looking at it. And then it also kind of falls on you in recognizing that power bar is the culture that you create, the rewards that you generate, the safety that you allow people to feel when they're a part of your organization, psychologically and otherwise. So for me, it's your job as a leader to create the power bar and to make sure that not only are you a source of energy for your employees, but that you could make them better when they plug in, and they're going to stay with you longer. Their power is going to provide more for you. So take a look at your organization, and are you battery powered, or are you plug in the wall powered? And when you do that, are you the power bar that allows all of this talent to plug in and thrive? And if you're not, then you're just using people. And when someone is being used, deep down inside, no matter how much you pay them, they're always, if you're going to get used anyway, you're just going to follow the money. But if you can find a way to pay people and at the same time give them intangible rewards, that's when you're going to create the best organization. And I think the first step is asking yourself honestly, which one are you, battery or power?
Yes, I guess to me as well, it's the short term versus the long term view, isn't it? Just generally, like the short term sometimes is fine. I mean, some industries, that's just how they operate, and with the best will in the world, we're never going to change that. But you do have to accept that if all you're doing is plugging a battery in and leaving it there till it runs out, you're going to just be doing that over and over again.
Our whole world runs on non-renewable resources, it seems.
Yeah.
And I think that if you think about it, the shift in the zeitgeist towards recognizing that alternative, this is off a little bit in the world, but not necessarily leadership, but the shift towards, we need to work more on renewable fuels, electricity. We're seeing much more focus on just an acceptance that this needs to happen. But if we see that mirrored in the work world now, where there's a lot more talk about the importance of health within your employees, the importance of psychological safety, that shift has mirrored the shift in society towards focusing on renewable energy. And then if we look at businesses, we can do the same thing. We're shifting from non-renewable sources, which is the idea that we're just going to keep chewing up employees because there's always going to be more. It's also started to shift towards how do we get the best, keep the best, and recognize that the culture has to shift to do it. And I think that there's a mirror image there in the way we think about everything from non-renewable to renewable. And I think that's key, because what we're doing sometimes without thinking is just assuming that there will always be another employee. There will always be someone who needs a job. And deep down inside, if that's true, it takes real leadership to not take advantage of it. It's really hard for someone who is benefiting from a system to look at the system and say, this needs to change. And that's why change is so slow, because it takes so much guts and so much willingness to empower other people, in some way sacrifice yourself, to rise to the top of a system and then say the system needs to change. It's really hard to do. And not a ton of people can do it. And it's why things change so slowly.
Yes, I'm at risk now of veering into politics, which I always try to avoid doing, because, I mean, there's a very clear parallel there, isn't there?
Yeah. I try to avoid politics as well. You know the difference between a politician and a leader, because they're not always the same.
Are they ever the same?
They're not. It's not at all. And we won't talk about politics, but I do like this difference in terms of whether you can identify whether someone's being a politician. And you don't have to be running for office to be a politician. We all have politicians in our workplaces. So the question is, are someone a politician or is someone a leader? And the way I look at it is, if you want to lead with integrity, one of the things you got to ask yourself is, how am I using fear? Because politicians add fear in order to try to win. And leaders try to remove fear in order to succeed, because success means trying to find the most effective route. All right. The most beneficial all around course of action. Winning, which is not success necessarily, is making sure you get your way. And very few things stand in the way of organizational success than the individual need to win. And that, to me, is a big idea about how you can really tell whether or not you are leading in a human-centered way. Is ask yourself honestly, how do you use fear? Is your goal in life to add a little bit of fear to motivate people to get what you want? Or is your mission to find a way to identify the things that scare people and make them a little less frightened? Because the root cause of every personal and organizational dysfunction is fear. Someone's afraid of something. And if we can deal with dysfunction and issues and conflict at the level of the fear that drives them, instead of the behaviors that emerge from the fear, I think we're going to be a lot better off.
Yeah, I think another way of telling the difference is talk to the people they lead or their followers and see how they perceive them. I think there's particularly in modern politics, there's some big clues there.
Politics.
Yeah, let's move on.
The problem with politics is that when you're a leadership speaker, when you focus at leadership, some of the highest profile examples of what people have come to believe leadership is politics. So the way people behave politically will always shape the way people see leadership. And so it's almost as if when we're talking about integrity, we're talking about values, it's almost as if there's a counter argument being made out there in the world for people to look at, but it's not an argument. It's just an example. But it also says, oh, all right, we hear about values, we hear about integrity, we hear about trying to empower other people. But then in some of the most archetypal leadership roles in the world, we don't see that. And then you've got you and me who, yes, we've accomplished our things and we've done what we want. And then you've got people who are on television all the time, and who, if you're a young person, are you going to listen to when you've got the person who's famous and you've got individuals you haven't heard of talking about different perspectives of leadership? Until we get more people who actually are in culture creating roles who are talking more and more about this, I think it's going to be hard to convince young people that the path to go is the one that seems to have less money and less profile. And the fact that that's out there in the world frustrates me so much. I'm not so much frustrated at politics in terms of what policy is. I'm frustrated at politics because it's a counter argument to everything I argue in my life. And it's really frustrating that I go out there and I say, that was a good speech. And then you turn on CNN and you're banging your head against, because what the same people who just saw the speech are going to hear is now they're going to hear this. And that person is, on television, and I'm the guy who came and spoke in the hotel ballroom. So it's hard, right?
Yeah, no, I have similar feelings about, let's not name them, but some of the big multinational corporations who are known to treat their employees in a certain quite old-fashioned manner.
And then they make billions.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So why wouldn't you follow that example if you're a business, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I know exactly how you feel. In all of the many ways of talking about what can be quite an intangible concept, everyday leadership is probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite. What is it for anyone who hasn't heard of it? And how would you explain what everyday leadership means and how leaders can benefit from it?
Yeah, I think the concept of everyday leadership, which is what they called my TED Talk, I didn't give it that name. They called it everyday leadership. And so the way I've taken to understanding it or explaining it is that everyday leadership is an approach to leadership that evaluates leadership based on daily behaviors instead of accolades and titles earned over time. So I'm not saying that if you're vice president of whatever, you didn't earn that and you're not a leader and that's not impressive. What I'm saying is, what did you do today to actually engage in leadership behavior? So everyday leadership says that leadership isn't in the titles, leadership's in daily behavior, and that leadership exists in individual moments of interpersonal impact, and that no matter what your title is, to truly be leading every day, you have to be creating moments of interpersonal impact, moments of compassion, of forgiveness, empowerment, courage, impact. And if you're not, that is a type of leadership that even when you're overwhelmed in your role, whatever your job is, no matter how title heavy it is, there is still a commitment every day to engaging in individual behaviors that impact others, that show courage, that have changed the trajectory of someone just a little bit. An analogy, I don't know if it's an analogy, but someone told me once that if a ship leaves New York City heading for London and it varies 2 degrees off course in the first 2 hours, it will end up hundreds of miles from London as it crosses the ocean. And the idea that we as leaders can every day consciously create a moment where we knock somebody 2 degrees in a positive direction, we have really just made a major impact. And if we look at individual moments as if having that kind of potential impact, I think we start to recognize that it's true leadership, and that your title and what you've accumulated cannot make you forget. And all of the responsibilities that come with that kind of bureaucratic leadership or a role that involves leading other people, all of that cannot stand in the way of you actually engaging in value-driven individual moments. And so everyday leadership is a type of leadership that is often driven out of people's lives the more responsibility they get. Family, work, whatever the case may be. That's what everyday leadership means to me, is a focus on not allowing the other forms of leadership that have become a part of your life and the other responsibilities you have to push out the fact that there are things you want to accomplish every day that are aligned with who you are. Because we can spend most of our lives being driven by our to-do list and completely ignore our to-be list. And a fundamental idea of everyday leadership is that we have to value our to-be list at least the same level as our to-do list. I'm not saying it's more important. We have obligations. We need to keep them. But if every obligation you have in a day is an obligation to somebody else, that's a life of obligation. Carve out 10% of your obligations in a day, make them obligations to yourself, make it an obligation to live individual moments that are tied to your core values, which means you have to figure out what they are, and then make sure that you give yourself that accountability and your credit for it at the end. That, I think, is a key piece of everyday leadership. And you cannot let all the other things push it out. If you carve out 10% of your day to make those kind of behavioral commitments to yourself, that leaves 90% for the rest of the world. And that's a life of service. And a life of service, that's empowering. That's sustainable. A life of obligation isn't.
It's a good way to look at it. Definitely. I think one of the things I love about it the most is that anyone can do it. And that certainly was the bit that was quite transformational for me when I first came across your talk. Because if anyone can do it, then imagine the impact that an entire organization could have collectively.
Yeah, I think the thing is that we focus on to do. If you're a manager, all of your one-on-ones are about what did you do? Where are you? It's very rarely about when do you feel most empowered at work? When do you feel happiest at work? What frustrates you the most? I had a CEO tell me that he'd go to the front lines and ask his people, what is the stupidest thing that we make you do every day? And it was really hard to get people to answer. But when people started realizing that they weren't going to be punished, but in fact, there was a pretty decent chance that whatever he identified was going to get looked at, people were much more responsive. But the power of a CEO to be willing to hear that is great. But we all do stupid things in our lives. We all do them. And I think that's human. And we realize that our organizations sometimes reflect our lives. And there are just little things that we keep doing because we never bothered to stop and really figure out how not to do them. And I think businesses do that too. And that to me is a great way of showing that you care, because recognizing what you don't know as a leader, because your responsibilities make it impossible for you to have the daily experience you need to truly understand. To be able to go to the people who do and say, I want to hear this, I think is a really great step. That's integrity. And then actually doing something about it. Not just, it's the same thing with coming up with corporate values and sticking them on your website. If you can't give me specific examples of how you did that, or more importantly, if you don't explain your decisions internally, referencing the company values, then they're not criteria for decision making. And I think that one of the key things that I always try to get across is that if a value isn't a value if you don't use it as criteria for decision making. Otherwise, it's just something that looks good on the website. That's not integrity. Doing stuff so that you look good, but you don't actually have to do it, that is not integrity. And I think some people do that without meaning to. It's not a malicious intent. It just is the reality of our lives. And a big part of everyday leadership and the day one approach is to recognize that there are so many distractions in our world that we need a process, one that actually is sort of rooted in human psychology that will allow us to break through all the distractions, that will basically trick our mind into doing these behaviors automatically. Because when we have to think about them and make time for them, ain't going to happen. Any process that we give that requires you to have a good day to make it happen or have extra time to make it happen is eventually not going to work, right? Because let's face it, not every day do we get up and we're like, ooh, today is going to be sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows.
Yeah, it's true. Definitely. So next question that I'm really interested to hear the answer to, what would be your favorite example of seeing this in practice?
For me, so many of them have been frontline service workers when I am having a terrible day. And, once I got up, right when I was writing the book, it wasn't going well. I had just gone through a really nasty breakup. I hadn't left the apartment in like 14 days. I smelled bad. And I went out and I wanted to get, there was a little French bakery in my building. So I went there and I didn't want to be happy because I felt that to be happy would be minimizing the things I was trying to overcome. And this woman came out and it was Christmas and she had a whole tray full of croissants and a Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer set of antlers and a big red nose on. And she was singing Christmas carols at the top of her lungs. And there was just something about that made me say that my day is a little bit better. And the way I look at the world is a little bit different that way. For me, the morning I had a horrifying day in my life where I lost the person I loved. She died very suddenly, and I was there that morning when we discovered this. And everything was so clinical, right? Like everyone has to investigate, and you've got EMTs there, and everyone has process. And one police officer made the point of coming over and talking to me as a person, not as someone who just, who was a witness to this, but as someone who they recognized was going to have to deal with this for the rest of their lives. What an extraordinary act of leadership. I had my little sister, who is one of my leadership heroes, and we didn't talk for a long time. It's not that we didn't like each other. It's just we weren't particularly close. And that's sad, I know, for some people. But after my father passed away, I moved out to help her run a restaurant. She had opened a restaurant on the 1st of March, 2020. And not the best time ever in history to open a new restaurant. 13 days later, they shut the restaurant down. She opens it up a couple months later. The day she reopens, our dad passes away. She closes it down again. So I went out to work with her, because I thought a tribute to my father would be to work with my little sister. He would like that. And in that time, I came to watch this young woman. She's younger than me, but you know what I mean? I watched my little sister put up with so much anger. Because, when restaurants opened back up, there were the rules and people did not react well to them. And my sister took such abuse, both online and in person, and she never lashed out at anyone who lashed out at her. And that, to me, I watched that for 4 or 5 months. And over again, I realized that there were moments of leadership there because she chose to elevate situations instead of escalate them. And to me, my favorite example of that type of daily leadership is watching people elevate situations instead of escalate them. And to me, those are my favorite examples. They really are.
I mean, that's 3 really great examples as well, and particularly from such difficult. I guess that's why they're such good examples, isn't it? Because they were difficult circumstances, and
to see the world as people instead of outcomes. To see the world as people instead of situations, and instead of evaluating the situation, taking a look at the humans within it, is a very difficult thing to do. It's something I still work on, but I think is an essential to that empathy that's crucial to modern day leadership, or the modern day leadership we need to overcome some of the challenges that we have.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think is the most common mistake that leaders and managers make?
I think the most common mistake, you know what, my friend? I think going into work or leadership when we haven't taken care of ourselves. And I think that failing to take care of oneself first is something that a lot of leaders fail at. The number one resource that's available to every leader that is ignored almost constantly is sleep. There's a book called Why We Sleep? The Surprising Science Behind Sleep and Dreams. A book that'll change your life. That failing to sleep consistently 5 hours a night over a long period of time is worse for you than smoking. That blew my mind. We do not take care of ourselves. We do not maintain our relationships. We do not achieve harmony between the things that bring us energy and take energy. I prefer harmony to work-life balance. We don't sleep enough. And that to me puts us in a position where we are not at our best to decide that, to make decisions that make us at our best, if that makes sense. When you're tired, you don't think right. When you are tired, you get frustrated faster. When you are tired, you think about how tired you are instead of how and why the person speaking to you is taking the position that they are. The number one mistake that leaders make is they bring a lesser version of themselves to their leadership. And the reason they do it is in service of their leadership often. You know, I want to set an example. I want to push hard. But so often what we do in service to our leadership actually makes us less effective leaders. Take care of yourself, eat better, go for a walk. I mean, that's tough. Like I was 350 some pounds and I dropped 100 pounds. Some of it came back on over the pandemic, but that it wasn't so much the weight loss. It was the daily practice of getting to the weight loss. And I wasn't even trying to lose weight. I was trying to gain health that made me better because I had made time for this important physical part of my life. That's what I think is the biggest mistake leaders make. They bring a lesser version of themselves in service of their leadership, which makes them less effective at delivering it.
That's quite an unusual answer to this question, I have to say. And I really like it. I think, and you mentioned leading by example, but I think a big part of that has to be about the harmony, as you say. I agree. I don't really like work-life balance either, but you end up using it because everyone knows what it means.
Yeah.
But it's setting the example on that as well. Like, do you really want everyone in your organization or everyone in your team to be burning the candle at both ends and barely sleeping or not sleeping enough? Because everyone then has a shorter fuse. You know, you're going to have more of the bad kind of confrontations at work. You're going to have less productivity because people are half awake half the time. And people feel like they, you know, even little things like they feel like they have to have lunch at their desk because they can't possibly take a break. They have to be at work. And then what they're eating as well, it'll be something that's quick and convenient and probably really unhealthy.
Yeah.
And it's all tied up in the same problem, isn't it?
We teach it early, man.
Yeah.
Like, think about students. We give them final exams. When, as a leader, would you get the best out of your people if you gave them the 5 biggest assignments of their job of the year all at the same time? That is bad leadership. If I said to you, hey, here's the 5 biggest projects that I need done this year, and they all have to get done this week, bad delegation. But we teach from a young age that this is what's expected of you. Burning the candle at both ends, pushing yourself to the brink is somehow training for the real world. Why, if that's the way we're taught, would we get into the workforce and think it was anything other than that? And so young people learn so many untaught lessons. Mm-hmm. And it turns into exactly what you just said right there, because we're making them do it when they're kids.
Yeah. I mean, I have a whole problem with the exam thing as well, just generally. Like, I
measures one type of intelligence.
Well, it does. Yeah. But I mean, just the volume of them. I think by the time I was in my first job, it would have been the first year for like 12 or 15 years that I didn't have an exam. And it was just, it's mad. I look back at it now, like, how did I do that?
Well, it's weird, right? We'll ask all these detailed questions for students in all these subjects, which they have to memorize and remember. Mm-hmm. But I ask adults, CEOs, people who have, objectively, at least in the eyes of the world, been successful. I ask them, why do you matter? And I cannot believe how few people can give me an answer to that, because they've never been asked before. I had been an educator for 13 years before I asked a student, why do you matter? And I'm pretty sure it was the first time anyone had ever asked him. How on earth are we letting people hit 18, 19, 20 years of age, the best educated people on the planet, and they have never been asked, why do you matter? If we don't ask, they won't think about it, because that's not what's evaluated. And I think that we spend 20 of the most formative years of our lives in a system that says, impress other people and you will be rewarded, and behave. And I think that the resistance to a broader form of leadership is because the leadership people have experienced growing up has all been top down, has all been directive. And I think that it's hard to convince someone that they have every right to call themselves a leader when they've been told to sit down, learn this, and regurgitate it to me for 20 years. How do we do that?
I think the biggest one for me is about you're not really being taught to retain knowledge or to learn it for its own sake in order to then apply it in the future. You're being taught to learn the answer to a very specific series of questions asked in a very specific way to pass an exam.
Yeah.
And that's it. And once you've passed that exam, it's really no good to you after that, to be honest.
And we're not teaching thinking. We're teaching remembering.
That's it. Exactly.
And we're teaching process. And to me, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but I think if we're going to talk about leadership, we have to talk about the way that we teach young people and the lessons that they're pulling out of it, because nobody leaves school and then decides to see themselves as not a leader. That's not how it works. By the time people graduate from whatever level of formal education they've been given, for those of us lucky enough to live in the Western world and get that education, they have already decided what their leadership is. And they may not have been taught it. They may not have been told it, but the system has made them realize where they fit. And they walk out of school already deciding, am I a leader or not? Which is why I have a career, because I get to come in and try to fight that idea. But if it wasn't encoded, like when I go and speak to high school students or college students, I'm trying to put myself out of business so that I don't have to talk about this with adults, right? If we can get them when they're young, I'm out of business, because by the time they get into the corporate world, there's no need to talk about this stuff anymore. But it'll be a while before I can put myself out of business.
Well, I mean, that's one of the tests of leadership, isn't it? Making yourself redundant.
That would be the hope. As I said to you, I just lost a leader in my organization who I'm only this week realizing he left on Friday, was an essential part of what, like, I knew he was an essential part, but you don't truly realize the hole that someone can leave until they go. And I also think that it's important to let them know that. It in the afterwards sort of be like, I knew how what you did mattered and impacted my life and our organization, but it's once you were gone that the following insights emerged. And I think they have the right to know that. I think that'll empower them for their next job. And I think if you can, like I said, not try to create great jobs, but try to empower people to become the type of people who are great at jobs, I think that's extraordinary leadership.
Yeah. And if you do the second one, then almost by default, you're going to do the first anyway, I suspect.
So many of the things we're taught are goals in leadership: money, power, influence, prestige. They're not goals. They're the natural byproducts that come from living your values and leading with integrity. So many of the goals we're taught to chase are not goals. They are byproducts of daily behavior. And if we can focus on the daily behavior, then people get to the byproducts.
Yeah. And it's a parallel again to something else we spoke about earlier. You know, if shareholders versus employees, like if you look after your employees, then they will look after the shareholders. So everyone's a winner, aren't they? In theory.
We hope so. Although the shareholders put, however less million in the pockets, but the world gets better. And there's the tension in today's world, right? Is the world gets better when more people are empowered. The way the things are set up now, fewer and fewer people are empowered by the work of more and more people.
Yeah, that's a problem I don't want to think about too much, if I'm honest.
True, but I think I don't want to think about it. But if I don't think about it, I do not pick a role in trying to change it. And I think that was so hard for me, because to engage in this reality of things we want to change politically, in things we want to change culturally, means to open yourself up to frustration. But if you don't, what is it? Pick a side. I don't like the phrase "we're at war," but if we don't pay attention to the things we want to change, we will not play a role in changing them. And even if it's the tiniest little role, right? Like, we got to play something, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to start somewhere, haven't you? Every journey with the first step and all of that. Yeah,
you got to start.
Many more cliches, I'm sure.
Recommit every day. That's it. The day one process is not about restarting every day. It's about treating every day as the first day so that you constantly move forward. It's almost counterintuitive, but if you commit to the first day, you will always be moving forward. And because the first day drives behaviors that would be way useful. This is me as a professional speaker. That would be very useful on day 100, day 1000, day 10,000. That is what drives us constantly forward.
Yeah. Way useful is fine. That totally works. No problem.
Every now and then I just sort of revert to the slang.
Yeah, I do all the time and probably don't even notice. So at least you realized.
The thing is, I'm now at an age, my friend, where I don't know what some slang means. Like someone said no cap to me the other day and I was baffled. No cap. Apparently someone told me I had riz. I'm not sure what that is, but apparently when I have never heard the word of the year, you know you have reached a certain stage in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Never heard of
comment.
It. Yeah, never heard the word of the year. They're like, here's the new word. I think I've never heard that spoken in my presence. So there's a perspective that comes, and I think every generation rolls their eyes and goes, this is insane. But come on, it's the world is constantly refreshed with the ideas of the next generation, and the generation that came before will always feel threatened by that. And I do not know a time in human history where that wasn't the case. But it also means that if we can get young people to embrace different ways of looking at things, demographics are destiny. And what the young generation wants and feels is coming, whether some people like it or not. And so figure out how to best empower and help those people make the best decisions, because they're about to be making them on your behalf.
Yes. No, it's true. I mean, there's many sayings about resisting change and its futility, isn't there? But I think it's maybe never more true than it is when we look at generational changes.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to someone else about this earlier today, and we were saying about handwriting and how they don't really teach it in schools anymore because everyone's got an iPad. And I had that moment of realization as well. It's like, oh man, am I like that guy when I was a kid who was always lamenting that nobody wrote letters anymore? Am I like that, but for typing on a keyboard or writing an email? Is that who I am now?
Yeah. Am I the guy who's like, how can you listen to this music? What is dubstep? I think that recognizing our perspective and always asking, am I pushing back against this because I don't understand it or I'm afraid of it? To me, that's integrity, is being able to ask yourself honest questions about how you feel. And it's hard to do because often it's hard to articulate how you feel and it's very confusing how you feel. But a question that I try to ask a lot when I'm in conflict, one is, what are they afraid of? And when I'm struggling with the decision, or I'm upset by something, or I'm pushing back, what am I afraid of? Your relationship with your own fear, I think, is a crucial part of living with integrity, because acknowledging when you're afraid, knowing how your fear impacts your decision making, and recognizing that it's not making the right decision, but overcoming the fear of the decision that's usually going to take you to the best place, I think it is really hard to do. It's hard to acknowledge when you're scared, particularly as men, when we've been taught not to do it. And so what happens is the fear manifests as anger, or it manifests as violence. It manifests as oppression. And so I think that coming to a better relationship with our fear is a key part of leading with integrity, because integrity is about living by your values. Understanding your fear, I think, is key to understanding your values.
Yeah. And it takes me back to one of those childhood lessons about you're only afraid of something until you understand it, until you shine the light under the bed or in the cupboard, whatever it was. And wherever the monster was hiding.
At least if you're afraid, then you're specific about what you're afraid of.
Well, yeah.
Right? Like sometimes I look under the bed and I'm like, that's terrifying. How did we not dust here? Yeah. I'm right. That is scary. But then at least you know what you're battling against, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Understand the problem before you can solve it. 100%.
Leadership Heroes.
Right. Well, I've got loads more questions that I'd love to ask you, but I don't want to steal too much more of your time. So I'm going to skip to the last question. I have a feeling you might have already answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's called Leadership Heroes. So my question is, if you had to pick one person It could be anyone you like. It could be alive, dead, past, present, real or fictitious, who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be and why?
Every time I'm given this opportunity, I always say I'd really like to have one more meal with my ex-girlfriend, my late girlfriend. I'd love to have one more meal with her. So that's always my answer to that, because the way she made my life better was the best leadership I've ever experienced. So I always go with that. And the reason I do that is that I believe all of your leadership heroes should be people that you know personally, because then you see how and why they make decisions. And the famous leaders, all we saw is the spin on their decisions. And I think that we didn't see how or why they made them. And I think, therefore, that we should look for our leadership heroes among the people who we get to see how and why they make decisions. Because anybody else I admire, that you want to pull out a name here, all we know is the spin that was put on their decisions by whoever won. You know what I mean? Like, whoever won historically gets to write the history. And so we only know the spin. And so for me, my little sister is a hero because I watch her again and again make integrity-driven decisions. I have 2 or 3 friends who boggle my mind in their ability to do the right thing. And so for me, my leadership heroes are the ones where I see not necessarily the right decisions come out of them, but the right way they make them. And sometimes making the decision the right way still blows up in your face. But that allows you to judge people not on the way their decisions worked out, but on the motivations behind them and how they went about making those decisions and the factors they worked into them. That's the people that I think should be our leadership heroes. For me, if I could have dinner though with anyone, I'd want to sit down with the people I loved who are gone, and I would want to ask them all the questions about what they learned that I didn't ask them while they were alive. Because your friends are your friends because you like and respect them. But we talk about our lives with our friends, but we don't necessarily talk about our lessons with our friends. And what are the lessons your friends, your family, your grandparents, the people you love? We've slipped in, when we get tightest with people, into talking about what's going on every day, as opposed to some of the bigger ideas that they have. I'd really like to have dinner with a lot of the people I loved. I'd like to have one more dinner with my dad, with Anastasia, with my grandparents, and ask them questions, not about how your day was, but how your life has taught. And I'd like the chance to do that because there's so much wisdom I let go because I was too busy just enjoying being with them. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a lovely way of looking at it, actually. Yeah, I sort of agree with you about who our leadership heroes should be. I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff and there's a lot of lessons we can still learn from particularly the historical figures. But again, yes, you know, and the further back you go, the less reliable our understanding of them is.
Hey, who doesn't want to have dinner with Jesus?
Well,
I have questions. I have questions, and I'd like to update them on some things, and go from there. Like who doesn't want to go back and find out what the truth is about? Because these are legends now, and the thing is, what the legend has become speaks to what we value. Because someone is turned into a legend or a hero and given things they may not have had, but it shows what the things people value are. Because that person actually probably didn't do that, probably didn't say that, probably didn't stand for that. But they did give people the opportunity to create a legend that showed how important those things were to culture at the time. Yeah,
that's it. And I think it's tough, isn't it? Because either we have to rely on their own words, which are, of course, going to be biased. And I love the use of the Churchill quote as well about the winners writing history. And big irony there is that he's picked quite a lot for this question.
Yeah. Churchill?
Yeah.
I don't drink anymore, man. I can't have dinner with Churchill.
Well, that's a good point as well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's particularly divisive these days, isn't he, of course? But I think, and I've said it a few times with other people's choices, but it's always more meaningful, I think, to have an answer where you've experienced that person's leadership yourself. Because as you say, you actually understand what they did, how they did it, maybe why they did it, depending on what your relationship was. And that is much more useful, I think, and much more meaningful, as I say. So, yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. That's really great stories. And I think we're pretty much out of time. I mean, I could go for another hour, but I don't want to be selfish. So,
man, I've had such a blast. Usually when I do podcasts, like it's, you know, you give the same answers because you believe in them, right? And people haven't heard them before on this particular podcast. I've really enjoyed sort of our meandering voyage through where leadership fits into culture and how it influences it. I think that's sort of been a different tack that we've chatted about today. So I hope it's still been useful to everybody listening. I've really enjoyed, like I said a couple things today that I'm like, I've never said that before. I want to write an article on that. That's the fun thing, right?
Yeah.
If we shut up and listen to questions and ask and encourage people to ask us questions by asking them questions, I think we learn more. But once we get to a certain point and we're considered a leader, I think we internalize the idea that you're supposed to share. If you call me and say, be a guest on the podcast, immediately my brain goes, you need to be a teacher. All right. You need to you need to spread all this knowledge or wisdom that you think you have, as opposed to just sitting here and peppering you with questions, which are going to make you go, well, what do you think? And so that's the decision that gets made. And I make it without even thinking. And even now at the end, I'm like, damn, I should have done this different.
Well, maybe next time.
Hey, I'm all for it.
Awesome. Well, Drew, the last thing I'm going to ask you is if any of the listeners, I'm sure all of them will want to know more about you, perhaps get a copy of the book or reach out, get in touch. Where can they go to learn more?
That'd be the best place would be drewdudley.com, DREWDUDLEY.com. And I'm on Instagram at day1drew, DAYONEDREW. And Instagram is pretty much the only social media I hang out on because it is usually the happiest. Here's my dog, here's my pets, here's my sunset.
That's fair, I think. Yeah.
It's gotten more political with the memes. But here's my dog, here's my food, here's my sunset. I can live with that.
Yeah. Yeah, there may be wisdom in there. Awesome. Well, I'll pop the link to both of those anyway in the show notes so all the listeners can find that easily and just click instead of having to remember or type, because who doesn't love that? And all that's really left for me to say is thank you again so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, your week, your month, your year, and so on.
David, this was an absolute blast. I think you're doing something great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, the feeling's mutual. Thanks again, Drew.
All the best.
Well, I know they say don't meet your heroes, but I have to say that that rule clearly doesn't apply to Drew. I really enjoyed that. So much so that I could have kept going for another hour quite easily. Listener, I've no doubt you got loads of value from that. If you did enjoy listening to Drew speak as much as I did and your interest has been sparked, I've popped his website in the episode description. So I do, as always, encourage you, click on that, go and find out more. I've also put the link to the TED Talk as well in case you haven't seen it. Highly recommend watching that. And it's hard to sum up a conversation like that. We covered so many different aspects of leadership. This idea of the day one, the everyday, the daily impact any leader can have is so powerful, so impactful that I really do encourage all of you, get a copy of that book, give it a read and start trying to apply it in your everyday work. And if you are looking for a community to share these ideas, to practice everyday leadership with, please do come and join us at Integrity Leaders. It's our online leadership community. It's for new leaders, first-time company founders, people hopefully just like you, listener. So if you want to find out more about that, head over to www.leadernotaboss.com and sign up today. Thank you again so much, Drew, firstly for agreeing to be with us today, but also for such an amazing conversation and for being so open with your stories and sharing your insights with us all as well. Listener, thank you for joining us. I hope you'll be back again next week when I'll be talking to Greg DeVore about his experiences founding and running a company that's all about helping businesses capture that tribal knowledge and ensuring it's not lost when people move on. So really important aspect there of leadership. internal development, culture, organizational development, all kinds of topics we're going to touch on. It's going to be an awesome conversation. Hope to see you there. And until then, stay safe, start practicing that daily impact you can have as a leader, and remember, as always, to be a leader, not a boss.